1 Peter chapter 2 verses 20 to 25. You have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls, beloved. If you are patient when you suffer for doing what is good, this is a grace before God. For to this you have been called. Because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that is footsteps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When he was insulted, he returned no insult. When he suffered, he did not threaten. Instead, he handed himself over to the one who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body upon the cross, so that, free from sin, we might live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you had gone astray like sheep. But you have now returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. The word slave is the translation of a Greek word meaning body. The Hebrew and Greek words for slave are usually translated as servant. Slavery as it existed under the Mosaic Law has no modern parallel. Mosaic law regarding slavery, or servanthood did not originate the practice, but only regulated the already existing custom. Slavery had its own set of laws which are outlined in Exodus 21 2-6. A Hebrew slave served for 6 years and then is released in the 7th year. Many servants and their masters helped each other in the common goals of the household, and the laws of the time viewed servants as property, as well as people. Some owners abused servants, but most didn't, but all servant owners treated them as socially inferior. Consider for a moment we are all servants or slaves, to someone or something. If students in school obey teachers, administrators, and other staff, they are doing the will of God, who gave those people authority over them. If workers in industry also submit to their boss's direction, again they would be doing the will of God. If you are in Congress, and do the will of the people, you too will most likely retain your job, and be well liked by your constituents who have authority over you. The only one who is not subject to authority is God himself, and even Jesus his Son was a servant of God the Father and did his will. Many Christians were household slaves and it was easy for them to submit to masters who were gentle and kind, but in today's reading Peter is encouraging loyalty and perseverance even in the face of unjust treatment. Ancient society was very status conscious and associated power with greatness. Peter identifies Christ with unjustly treated servants. Suffering is an unavoidable part of life. Sometimes we sin, and bring suffering on ourselves. Sometimes the suffering comes into our lives because we live in a fallen world, and suffering is unavoidable. Peter is writing about suffering that comes as a result of doing good. Christ never sinned, and yet he suffered, so that we could be set free of our sins, and regain friendship with God. But here Peter is speaking about suffering that comes to a person because that person is doing the right thing. Aren't we also shunned or suffer for expressing our Christian views? Christ never sinned, but he certainly did suffer for us. Jesus' whole life was spent in service to others, and yet he suffered. Peter knew that all who followed Jesus must be prepared to suffer. We need to face suffering as Jesus showed us, with patience, with calmness, and with confidence that God has a purpose in allowing this suffering to enter our lives. I am reminded of a story about an 18-year-old, named Sammy, who became a Christian. His entire family belonged to another religion and shunned him. Sammy would not allow himself to be shut out of the family, so he visited whenever he could. When his father became ill, Sammy overlooked family's slighting, and took care of his father, while praying for his father's recovery. When God healed him, the family began to warm up to Sammy. Over time, his loving Christian attitude softened the family's negative attitude toward him, and some of his family members became willing to hear about Jesus. Verse 19, For whenever anyone bears the pain of unjust suffering, because of consciousness of God, that is a grace. It is God's grace that strengthens Sammy, and strengthens us, so that we can endure the unjust suffering in order to pursue our Christian goals. Verse 21, Have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his footsteps. Peter then goes on to remind us that possessions, accomplishments, and the people in our lives will eventually fade away or disappear. Only God's will, his word, and his work are permanent. We We must change the focus of our lives from time, money, prestige, and power to the eternity yet to come. It has often been said, burial shrouds do not come with pockets. We came into the world, naked, and dependent, we will leave the world in the same way, but death is not the end but the beginning of all eternity. They, then, who are destined to die, need not be careful to inquire what death they are to die, but into what place death will usher them. Saint Augustine. The choice is only yours, eternal suffering or eternal joy.